Hi there, I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council. We had really just one item for discussion at tonight's agenda. There were two items to start with. It was all in preliminary open, and part of the reason why is these are pretty meaty subjects. So the first item, which I had requested a couple of meetings back, was for us to have a discussion in preliminary open meeting. This is not where ordinances typically get voted on, but where we give direction for ordinances to come back to us on the parameters of no longer being a recipient of HUD funding. That got punted. Long story short, that's going to come back at a future meeting, hopefully very soon, when we have a clearer definition of the agenda item so we can have the discussion that really needs to be had about that. Which means all of the discussion that took place pretty much was for short-term rentals. So at the last meeting, during preliminary open meeting, when we have the opportunity to request items on a future agenda, I requested that we come back with an actual ordinance that we could actually vote on to actually restrict short-term rentals in Plano. Now, this was not that meeting. This meeting was to discuss, again, the parameters in preliminary open, the parameters of an ordinance which we would later discuss and vote on. Now, I requested for it to be on the agenda. Councilman Grady seconded it after the most recent shooting we've had at a short-term rental in Plano. I can't say the shooting, but the most recent shooting we've had at a short-term rental in Plano. And even though we placed it on the future agenda, being tonight's agenda, before the regular meeting, where folks had the opportunity to comment during comments of public interest, when people started coming, and I said this in my last recap, the signs that they were holding up very clearly captured what I myself was feeling. They said, enough is enough. So tonight, we just literally went around the dais, each of us providing our comments about what we would like to do, what we would like to see as a next step in the short-term rental saga. And I think it is a saga at this point. So I'm going to just recap, literally, this is my video recap. I'm going to recap what I said on the dais and then tell you where we're going from here. So I hogged the mic for quite a while because I've got a lot to get off my chest about this. And as I said in the meeting, this has been building up in me for 3.5 years. We've had piecemeal discussions about this in open meeting here and there. So this was the first big, real opportunity to have a robust discussion in public meeting on the short-term rental issue. Now, it's important to note that for the past year, we've had folks from the Texas Neighborhood Coalition, actual Plano residents who are part of the Texas Neighborhood Coalition, coming to speak during comments of public interest at our meetings. We as council are prohibited from actually engaging in debate or discussion about what's said during comments of public interest. We can only respond with factual information. So tonight, since we put it on the agenda, we were able to have that robust discussion. So speaking for myself, this was put on my radar 3.5 years ago. I had been elected for a few months, and we had a shooting and a murder at a short-term rental party house in East Plano. That was the first time that I was exposed to discussions on council about short-term rentals. And then that was late in 2019. Shortly thereafter, we were all sideswiped and distracted by the events of 2020 for obvious reasons. And then when the Texas Neighborhood Coalition started frequently, every meeting, coming to speak at our council meetings, it got put back on our radar. But that was a year ago. So really for 3.5 years, and I presume there were discussions had on council prior to my election in 2019, but from my perspective, for 3.5 years, we've been gathering more data, seeing what happens, tracking various lawsuits around the country. And so when those folks showed up at the last meeting with the signs saying enough is enough, that really captured my feelings. So there are a few nuances to this. First, it is extremely important to note that in Plano's zoning definitions, there are numerous definitions for numerous property types. There are three in particular: motel/hotel, bed and breakfast house, and boarding slash, it's boarding room, basically. And none of these are permitted in residential areas. Back when our zoning ordinances were written decades ago, they were very explicitly excluded from residential areas, neighborhood designations. Not even in multifamily areas are they permitted. The folks in the city at the time, the planning department and the city council, made a very deliberate decision to not allow them in residential areas, but only by nuance of definition, because back then nobody conceived that a thing like a short-term rental app might be available to pick a short-term rental in your area. Nobody conceived that that would ever be a thing because it wasn't a thing. That's kind of a black swan moment. So we knew that short-term rentals have been a thing for decades in beach destinations, entertainment destinations, ski destinations, things like that. Never in a place like Plano until, like, figuratively speaking, 5 minutes ago, when you could go online and see what's available in your area. And so while there are some legitimate purposes that people might want to get an STR, we have heard consistently from folks that they do not want them in their neighborhoods. So I submit to you, is this NIMBYism? If every last person says not in my backyard, maybe they shouldn't be in anybody's backyard, okay? So a few points that I went over. That was the first one, that our zoning categories very explicitly excluded purposes which would have a short-term rental as a purpose, distinguished from a short-term rental as a type of use, but as a purpose. So, like bed and breakfast, for instance, it specifically says in our zoning ordinance that it's owner-occupied. Well, an Airbnb isn't owner-occupied, so it doesn't fall under that definition. Hotel, motel, or it's actually motel/hotel, but still. It specifies that daily maid service shall be provided. Well, there goes STRs from that classification. Boarding or rooming house. That says any room that, or any house not including a hotel or a home care facility that has 3 or more rooms for rent. Now, on one hand, you could make the argument that that meant 3 separately let rooms, but it doesn't say that. Also, you could make the argument that that would include any leased property. However, it says rent. It specifically uses the word rent. In our multifamily definition, it says rent or lease. So in our own zoning ordinances, it makes the distinction between renting and leasing. Now, the bottom line here is that there are arguments to be made all around, and we have reached the point where something has to be done. So I also touched on the issue of property rights. I am a strong proponent of property rights, and property rights are not absolute. If they were absolute, then we wouldn't have zoning at all. We would say any restriction on what you do with your property is a violation of your property rights. Of course, nobody believes that, and so we're not discussing that. So I don't believe that short-term rentals, by their nature, they are operating as hotels, notwithstanding daily maid service. That's not a residence, that is a business. So just because you sleep there one night does not make it a residence. People who lease their homes, like for a month or a year or 5 years, I've got a great neighbor, good friend, who's been leasing his home as long as I've been in this neighborhood, almost 6 years. So that is an actual residence where you furnish it with your stuff. You invite people over on a semi-regular basis. You sleep there for a prolonged period of time. Not Rip Van Winkle style, but night after night. You get the idea. So I don't think anybody has a right to operate a short-term rental in a residential area any more than they have a right to operate a cafe in their front porch, or a bar on their back porch, or an auto body shop out of their garage. We place restrictions on all these things and nobody bats an eye because, well, of course you don't allow that in a residential area. One of the most important things to capture, though, is that while the shootings, the brothels, there was a brothel busted up in Plano operating out of a short-term rental last year, and the party houses and all this stuff. Those are the ones that grab the headlines. That is not the only complaint that our homeowners have. Consistently, we have heard that when there are short-term rentals operating nearby, let alone next door, they don't have neighbors. The word neighbor is built into the very word neighborhood. When people seek neighborhoods, they seek them for that reason, not to have revolving doors all around them. There is a fabric, a community fabric to a neighborhood that hotels don't have. Hotels do not have a community because they're hotels. So it's no wonder that short-term rentals dissolve and erode the fabric of a neighborhood. And the neighborhood is what people move there to begin with, for. They have been very clear and consistent about this. Even if that short-term rental next door has never caused a problem, you never know if it will. Will tonight be the night that it finally does? You don't know because it's kind of like Russian roulette. Every night you're getting a different chamber. Will that one be the one with a bullet in it? Potentially, quite literally, as we had this shooting with some 30 shots fired just 2 weeks ago. So anyway, I touched on all these things and I said that we owe it to our residents to preserve the fabric of their neighborhoods and fulfill the value proposition that brought them or kept them in Plano to begin with. Everybody came here for the same reasons. Great schools and safe neighborhoods. That's it. All we have to do is not mess that up. So there was enough consensus, I think, around the dais to come back with, we got to go through the proper processes, but a temporary ban on short-term rentals. Now, this would probably likely ban new short-term rentals. I don't know that it would exclude, I don't know that it would apply to shutting down existing short-term rentals. Personally, I believe that a wind down period is reasonable for existing short-term rentals, but we're going to go forward with the process of, we've gotten data about which short-term rentals are in Plano. We're going to look at the corresponding crime statistics. We're going to go through a period of public input, but we're not going to let the problem proliferate while we go through that process. So expect at an upcoming meeting, it may take a few meetings because there's a legal runway. You have to have so many days and so many notifications and so many opportunities for public input for zoning. Has to go through P&Z council. I think, don't quote me on this, I think it's going to come back in late April. Again, don't quote me on that. For us to actually consider an ordinance where we place a temporary ban on short-term rentals and we continue the process. The end game, from my perspective, I'm only one of 8 council members, but from my perspective, is to ensure that the very clear intent, the unmistakable intent of our zoning ordinances is honored and respected, and that ultimately, however long this takes and however much effort we have to put into it, that our residential areas do not have what are in effect hotels operating out of them. So that was the big short-term rental discussion. Now we had to pause the short-term rental discussion and go to regular meeting because we have to start that at 7. Then we came back to the short-term rental discussion. Finally, some people who were waiting very patiently to chime in during comments of public interest at almost 8 o'clock were able to have their say. So this was about at least one pet store in Plano that is able legally to sell dogs bred through a puppy mill. We heard about some very inhumane conditions in which these dogs are bred. So I requested that as soon as staff could gather the data and the options, that we have a discussion in public meeting, an open meeting, for options to make sure that anything on this matter, that anything that we're doing in Plano is not, at the least, enabling inhumane treatment of animals or humans, for that matter. Although this one pertains specifically to animals. So look for that in an upcoming meeting. This went on almost 16 minutes. There's more juice than I thought we could get out of the short-term rental discussion, but it's a pretty meaty discussion. So tune in next meeting. We are going to hopefully have the HUD discussion, then we'll get it back up as soon as we can. And that's probably going to be another 15-minute recap just on that topic. So thank you for tuning in. I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council. Good night and God bless.